Welcome,
Hello.
everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this month's forum. Today we have Dr. Nathan Smith from Fresno Pacific University, who's going to go over the verdict of reason: why gay marriage can't be the real thing, and it should not be recognized by law. So, Nathan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I teach economics at Fresno Pacific University, small Christian college in California. And a couple of years ago, because it was a hot topic and I had some thoughts about it, and I wrote a book on gay marriage with the title that he just described. The cover is shown here on the slide. And I made this myself, and it's very significant. What it shows here is two DNA strands, one with the female symbol and one with the male symbol, bound together by two wedding rings. And that sort of summarizes, I think, in an image, what I think marriage is, and not just how our society defines it, but it's much more fundamental than that, what it always has been. There were kind of two sets of arguments in the book. One was about self-binding, the sort of contract theory, you might even say. And the second one was about sociobiology, and I kind of added that in as an afterthought because I figured as long as I'm going to be writing about same-sex marriage, I should say what I think marriage is. But I think that ended up being the part of the book that people were more interested in when they read it. And so that's the part that I'm going to be focusing on today. And in some ways, this is a very ironic presentation. This is a Christian apologetics presentation, I would say, in which Richard Dawkins is kind of like the hero. Like, I'm using his concept of selfish genes a lot here. I think it's very useful. I don't agree with Richard Dawkins in philosophical terms. I mean, I think he's completely inept in his critiques of Christianity, but I think that his scientific contribution to biology is quite useful, and actually is kind of the great secret weapon that social conservatives can use if they have a mind to, if they discover it. And I'll hope to show what I mean by that as we move through the presentation. I also want to introduce my sister, Rachel Liu, who's also here with us today. She's a senior contributor at The Federalist, and she's written for Crisis, Public Discourse, Human Life Review, First Things, National Catholic Register, National Review, and a number of other publications. And she teaches philosophy at the University of St. Thomas. And she's a lot more famous than me. You're writing something as well on same-sex marriage right now. I was just wondering if you want to mention that for a second so people know who you are, if you want to jump in later. And
Sure, yeah.
expand on my points.
What I'm working on right now is actually an essay to be contributed to a whole book of essays that's being compiled by Janet Smith. She's a professor at a Catholic seminary in Detroit, and we're also doing a conference in August, which might be of interest to some people. This is kind of inter-Catholic baseball, but it's basically trying to come up with ways in which Catholics can respond both faithfully and compassionately to people who experience same-sex attraction. So I guess that's the main topic. My paper is on basically homoerotic attraction and why it's fundamentally disordered. I guess that would be the main topic of it. But yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. But again, for people who are especially interested in sort of what Catholics are saying about this leading up to the Synod on the Family in the fall, that's really kind of what people are talking about in this book and this conference.
Rachel and I have had a lot of debates on questions about marriage and sociobiology and the topic of this book over the years. And it's funny because I think we agree, and she tends to think we disagree. Anyway, well, it's been. I always feel like I learn a lot from her, so I'm really glad she's here. So the big question I'll start with: what is marriage? For Christians, the answer has been around for thousands of years. We already know what we think about it. The Old Testament and the New Testament clearly condemn homosexuality. They both define marriage as between a man and a woman. That's not a complete definition. I'll give you more later. But at least on that, that's quite clear for Christians. Now, that position was completely normal until maybe 20, 30 years ago, and now it's become profoundly unfashionable to the point where many people would even regard it as offensive. Most young people have been caught up in the spirit of the times, and they support same-sex marriage. They don't believe homosexuality is a sin. And this is a real challenge for churches because a lot of young people will disagree with their churches on questions of homosexuality and same-sex marriage, which often causes them to leave churches. And I think ultimately, if there's some fundamental point on which, even if it's relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, this is definitely going to be a wedge that drives people from the churches. So I think it's important for parents who want to raise their kids in the faith, for pastors, to know why we believe what we believe and to be prepared to defend it. And that's what made me write the book. That's what I'm going to try to help people do in this presentation today. Now, my basic answer is that marriage is based on a merger of genetic interests. So it's a biological union, and I'll explain this a little bit more as we move on, but it's this merger of genetic interests that makes marriage permanent and exclusive. This is why we want marriage to be permanent and exclusive. Some people would say, well, isn't marriage about love? Yeah, of course it is. But love in general doesn't have to be permanent and exclusive. You can have lots of different friends. If you lose touch with some of your friends sometime, that's no big sin. That's true with parental love. It's a little bit different too. I mean, that's a permanent relationship, but it's not exclusive because you might have a lot of different children. It's really a special property of marriage that it should be permanent and exclusive, and it's related to the way marriage unites people's genetic interests. Now, heterosexual couples can be one flesh in this sense. It's related to reproductive complementarity, and this creates all sorts of beautiful instincts for mutual love and self-giving that can really be at the center of a married life. Now, for same-sex couples, the trouble is they can't have this merger of genetic interests. So as a result, they don't have the same instincts. It's certainly not to say that they can't love each other, but the love that they'll have for each other will be somewhat different in character. And so these desiderata, permanence and exclusivity, don't really cross-apply. We'll look in a minute at some statistics that show that permanence and exclusivity really are typical of straight couples, but are not typical of same-sex couples. And that's exactly what the sociobiology would lead us to expect. So that's what I'll be trying to elucidate.
Can I quickly say, so when you say a merger of genetic interests, you are talking about the genetic interests of the two involved individuals, specific individuals.
Yeah, of the man and the woman. So
okay.
In a permanent and exclusive marriage, then my only chance to contribute to the next generation is through my wife, and my wife's only chance is with my help. And so we have basically the same genetic interests. I mean, in-laws are a partial exception, but and that causes it to be very natural for us to cooperate and to share our lives together.
Right.
So now, why do genetic interests matter at all? Well, for one thing, they will shape our behavior, they'll shape our desires, they'll shape our instincts. And this goes really all the way back to, you can think of this as going back to the Stone Age. I'll take a strictly evolutionary point of view for a moment and say, let's suppose we've evolved over millions of years, and well, who's most likely to have survived and reproduced in the Stone Age? What characteristics would contribute to our survival and reproduction in the Stone Age? And well, whatever traits those are, those will be well represented in the population today, because those individuals will have survived, reproduced, they'll have spread their genes through the gene pool, and so we should expect ourselves to have lots of traits that would make us flourish in the Stone Age. Now, why do I keep talking about the Stone Age? Because evolution is a really slow process, and so we haven't had time to adapt to the very different conditions of civilized life. So our genetic interests will inform our instincts. And I'll give a couple of examples of why battle courage tends to be more of a male trait, why women have a kind of natural modesty that men lack, and show why these arise from genetic interests. But the relevance of instincts to ethics is a little bit tricky. Certainly, we shouldn't always follow our instincts. So just to show that we have an instinct for something doesn't show that we should do it. But I think C.S. Lewis had the right approach to the question of ethics and instincts in Mere Christianity. And what he says is morality isn't one of our instincts. We do have instincts. Morality isn't one of those. Instincts are more like the keys of a piano. And the moral will is the pianist who decides when to play the different instincts. So ethical behavior involves sometimes encouraging our instincts, sometimes overriding our instincts, but not taking any of the instincts as a rule in itself. And I think marriage is a good example of this. Marriage involves overriding some of our instincts and encouraging other instincts in order to fit with a larger design for an ethical life, for a rational life that we have in mind. But same-sex couples just don't have the same instincts to work with, so you end up with quite different behaviors. And I'll try to show this with a bunch of statistics. I'll go through these fairly quickly, but I'm going to try not to present any statistics that are really controversial. So these would be ones where you could get lots of different sources for the same statistics. There would be other statistics that would be controversial. I'll avoid those. So the first is that the married two-parent family is the best environment for kids. And hundreds of studies show this. They show it with respect to all sorts of different characteristics, such as health, education, poverty, access to basic services, family violence. This is a very consistent result across many different countries, large samples, small samples. So this is a good reason for us to try to encourage marriage, and a good reason for us to regard marriage as a desirable institution. And I think this has become widely accepted now, even among liberals in the left. Do you think is that your impression, Rachel?
Sorry, is it my impression that
even liberals in the left and the left are starting to accept that the married two-parent family is the best environment for kids?
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of, that would have been more controversial maybe in the 60s or 70s, but it's started to be more generally embraced. Unfortunately, there's been a large rise in births outside of marriage, and that's shown in this slide. And the rise might have been curtailed a little bit by welfare reform in the mid-90s, but basically it started in the 60s and it's been rising ever since. And I think this is the biggest single driver of the increase in class stratification that's occurred in our society and that a lot of people are worried about. Usually among college-educated, affluent people, then it's still the norm for marriage to precede having kids. But among the lower classes, it's become much more common for kids to be born outside of wedlock and for a lot of children to grow up without fathers or to grow up in mixed families where they have stepfathers and stepbrothers and stepsisters and so on. There's been a real departure from this norm. But it is possible to achieve a society in which all the kids are growing up with their biological parents, because we had it back in the 40s and the 50s. So somehow we've lost that, and I don't think anybody really knows how to get back to it. But anyway, that's an important.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That this is one of the things that sociologists like Charles Murray like to talk about.
Yeah.
That the difference between the ratios of college-educated women versus women who, say, don't graduate from high school, how likely it is that their children will be born within wedlock. And it's dramatic. I should have the statistics right in front of me, but it's sort of like a significant majority of children born to non-high school graduates are born out of wedlock, and for college-educated women,
Yeah.
it's like more than 90% are married, right? So
Yeah.
people who already have a lot of resources are doing this in a way that contributes further to their ability to successfully raise a family, and the people who most need the support of marriage are the ones who are not getting married. So
Yeah.
major contributor to sort of class divides in America today.
There's a book on this, Our Kids by Robert Putnam, has been illustrating that very effectively with lots of statistics. So it's one of the biggest challenges that our society faces right now. Marriage tends to make people happy. Another point in its favor. If you ask married people whether they're very happy, then about 42% will say yes. It's less than half that for never married or divorced. So, and marriages do tend to last forever, in spite of what you hear about the rise of divorce. And it's true that there's a lot more divorce than there used to be. But in spite of that, this chart shows marriages between 1960 and 1964. Almost 60% of them were still together 30 years later. Those between 1970 and 1974, it's almost 60% of them together 20 years later. And this is from 2002, so it's a little bit old data, but the ones that started in the 1980s were still mostly together after 10 years. So among straights, it really is typical for marriage to be permanent. It's also typical for marriage to be exclusive. So this is based on asking people whether they've been faithful within marriage, and most men say that they have. About 3/4 of men, even more of the women, about 85% say that they have. And among homosexual males, it's only about 5%. Now, admittedly, you're comparing married straight couples with gay couples who generally wouldn't be married, so it might be a little bit apples and oranges. But since these relationships are shorter, they've actually had a lot less time to cheat, if that's the right word for it. And so in some ways that makes this gap even more impressive. I think more than any other single statistic, this just very dramatically shows the behavioral patterns of homosexuals and heterosexuals are just not the same. So, and so then there's a question: should we want them to be, or should we call them by the same term if they're behaving differently? And of course, another question is this just a cultural thing? Is it just that since they don't have the institution of marriage, they're behaving differently? And that's where sociobiology can shed some light, I think. But well, we've seen a lot of good things about marriage. It's good for children. It's good for people's happiness. It really does tend to be permanent. Unfortunately, it's becoming less common. So this chart shows a dramatic fall in marriage rates since the 1960s. And it seems to have been maybe even accelerating a little bit at this time period since around 2000, when gay marriage has become a big issue. That's not huge. I mean, I wouldn't want to stake a lot on saying that because gay marriage has created so much confusion about marriage, what marriage is, then people don't want to commit to it. That may or may not be true. It's a little bit hard to say based on this data. But what we definitely see is that marriage is in decline. So that might cast doubt on our society's qualifications to judge this issue. But okay, now looking at same-sex relationships, they're much less likely to be permanent. It is a little bit difficult to collect data on gays and lesbians because they're a small fraction of the population. So if you just do a population survey, you'll get very few of them and you won't get sufficient sample sizes. This is a gay and lesbian consumer online census. May not be entirely representative, but we do the best we can. Most of them are in relationships that have been between 1 and 7 years long. Very few of them have been together for 20 years or more, or even 15 years or more. So this pattern contrasts sharply with this, where you have people mostly still being together 30 years later. So less relationship stability. Many of the slides I've taken have been drawn from the Family Research Council, but I wanted to bring this one in, which is from the Journal of Marriage and Family, and these are scholars who are trying to argue that same-sex relationships have similar properties to heterosexual relationships. So what they show is the hazard rate, the breakup rate of straight and gay and lesbian couples, depending on how long they've been together. So the solid red line down here shows with heterosexual married couples how likely they are to break up. The red dotted line shows if they're just dating. If you've just been dating for a certain period of time, how likely are you to break up? Obviously, marriage makes a big difference. If you're married, you're a lot less likely to break up than if you're just dating. Now, they try to sort out unmarried, same-sex couples into unmarried and sort of with marriage-like relationships, whether or not that's permitted, marriage is permitted in a given place and time. And you see the hazard rates of breakup are considerably higher, even in the ones that they identify as marriage-like. More than twice as high for much of this time period, and they only started 5 years in. So they want to argue that same-sex couples look similar to straight couples, but that's not really what their data support. If you look at that data series, where marriage is available for gays, not as many of them take it up. So Sweden and the Netherlands, this is where some civil unions were available. Vermont, this is where gay marriages were available. And it will be very interesting to see what kind of statistics emerge as gay marriage is legalized in more and more places, whether it becomes more normal or whether we continue to see only 21% being married. You notice with straight couples, with straight people, it's about 52%. Actually, this would be the whole population, but since the vast majority of the population is straight, then 52% would be kind of an estimate of how many straight people marry, whereas 21% would be for gays. So certainly the idea that marriage is just a norm is less common among same-sex attracted people. Homosexuality also tends to be associated with suicide, and which may suggest that it's not particularly conducive to happiness. Of course, the LGBT advocates would say that this is the fault of the culture, that the culture is judging these people too much, and there may be some truth in that. It may be that we're not kind enough, not generous enough to people who feel homosexual attraction, and then that causes a greater incidence of suicide. But I think there's also some reason to think of this as indicative of whether homosexual lifestyles are conducive to happiness. Okay, so my interpretation of the data that I've shown so far is that the data really vindicate traditional sexual morality. For heterosexuals, what I would call conjugal marriage, permanent and monogamous marriage, it's not just an ideal. This is actually normal. This is the typical way that heterosexuals live. And it's also good for children who flourish best when raised by a father and a mother. Among homosexuals, relationship permanence and monogamy are not so typical. And they're not widely accepted even as ideals. And I think we see this in some of the advocacy for gay marriage. So, for example, gay marriage advocate Jonathan Rauch defines marriage as being about reliable caregivers and settling the young. He leaves out sexual fidelity. He doesn't want sexual fidelity to be an important part of it. I think this reflects the priorities of the gay community. It doesn't reflect what marriage has ever been about or is about today for straights. So there's a basic difference in what we mean by marriage here. Now, the statistics may be surprising to you if you've just been following the news, because newspapers and politicians love to describe same-sex couples as being just the same as straight couples. And they'll often give stories about one particular heartwarming couple that looks just like the straight couples that you know, but they just happen to be both men or both women. But you can't let your worldview be formed by anecdotes, because anecdotes may be representative or they may be unrepresentative. And if they may be unrepresentative, then that you shouldn't infer patterns from them that aren't there. In effect, what the journalists and the politicians are doing is cherry-picking data points that support their case. The statistics don't support their case. Now, this could just be because of cultural conditioning. I think if you convince someone that, well, yes, same-sex couples do behave differently, they might say, well, that's just because of the culture. And that's where where we can appeal to Darwinian sociobiology and make a strong argument that these are really permanent behavioral patterns with roots in human nature. We shouldn't expect them to go away. We shouldn't expect that just because we call same-sex couples married means they'll behave as if they're married. There's a reason based in human nature for these differences. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I teach economics at Fresno Pacific University. You might wonder why a Christian economist is making arguments from Darwinian sociobiology. For one thing, Darwinian sociobiology might seem inconsistent with Christianity. It also might not seem like it's my area of expertise. Well, doubtless that's true to some extent, but there is actually a deep connection between economics and evolutionary biology. So Darwin's theory was inspired partly by reading the classical economist Thomas Malthus, Malthus was theorizing about the effects of population on living standards, and Darwin used the same idea, that as organisms become more and more populous, they'll eventually use up the resources in their environment, and that's when survival of the fittest kicks in, and when you start to see natural selection. So economics and Darwinism both study the unintended consequences of competition for scarce resources. So that applies in biology and economics. You could think of some of the famous phrases cross-apply very well. You could think of the invisible hand of the market that economists like to talk about. We could apply this to natural selection in the biological sphere. Survival of the fittest could describe competition among firms. Now there's an interesting irony here, I think, which is that living nature, if you go out and observe it, it seems to be in an ecological equilibrium. You can go to a forest in 5000 BC and then come back to the same forest today, and it might look pretty similar. But biologists tend to stress evolution. They tend to stress a process of change. So what we seem to see is equilibrium, but biology stresses a process of change. In economics, on the other hand, what we tend to see in the world is constant progress and evolution, new technologies coming along, firms being destroyed, whole new modes of business organization emerging, and yet economists love to stress equilibrium in all their theories. So it's kind of an ironic divergence there, I think. But what I basically advocate is Darwinian reasoning, but treating Darwinism as a method of reasoning from ecological equilibrium rather than talking about evolution. That's not necessarily rejection evolution. You could believe that evolution is true, but I think as a mode of reasoning, it's sort of a way of reasoning from equilibrium. And how am I doing so far? Is this clear? Any questions?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I didn't have any question. I didn't have a question.
I was just going to say, I don't know where exactly. So, insofar as we have disagreements about this, I have no quibbles with any of your any of your your sociological statistics and charts and so forth. But we sometimes encounter difficulties when we try to bridge the gap, right, from your economic and sociobiological arguments to some kind of normative conclusion. One thing that's ironic about that, of course, is that we mostly agree on the normative conclusions. We just disagree sometimes about whether your arguments get us there, right? I have different ideas about how I'd like to get there. I'm not sure whether I think your arguments get us there, right? But so now this is kind of a relevant point. Maybe this would be a good place for you to, I don't know, it's not entirely clear to me based on all these things you just said. I can see why there are certain similarities between Darwinian evolution and economics, but it's not necessarily clear why either one of these is going to be a sound basis for building a normative moral argument.
Okay, yeah, no, that's good. So I suppose at the beginning I talked about C.S. Lewis and the piano analogy for how we relate to the instincts. Now, I think Darwinian reasoning, I think, can shed light on our instincts. It can help us to think clearly about them. It can help us to understand them. It can help us to distinguish what's the local cultural programming from what is fundamentally part of some kind of universal human nature. Mm-hmm. Now, that probably just still leaves open the question of how the instinct should be used. But one example I like to use, suppose you have a bunch of visitors who are coming from some very far away culture about which you know almost nothing. And for some reason, you're supposed to entertain them for a day. So maybe they got stuck in the airport or something, and you've got a group of men and women, and you're supposed to entertain them for a day. Now you think, well, what would they like to do? Well, since I know almost nothing about their culture, I can't really appeal to that. But
large tables of delicious food. That's my recommendation. Can't go wrong with that. Continue. Sorry.
Well, yeah. So then what I'd say is, men in the age of hunter-gatherers, they would have liked to go out hunting. They'd like to take risks and kind of competing. And we can kind of see when today men like going to the arcade, they're kind of doing something similar. They like playing video games. They're kind of doing something similar to the old hunting that they did in ancient times. So women, meanwhile, they tended to specialize as gatherers in the Stone Age. And so nowadays, women like shopping. And there seems to be kind of a link here, because going out and gathering useful plants is a little bit like shopping. And so I observe in my culture that men tend to like the arcade and women tend to like shopping. And this probably isn't just cultural, because I can see where it would come from in evolutionary terms. So maybe I'll take the men to the arcade and I'll take the women out shopping, and a good time is had by all.
Well, I find that kind of a dubious example, just because there are so many ways it could misfire. But I understand what you're saying, rather than dissect the example, which probably wouldn't be that helpful. I guess maybe, so I'll interject something here, and if it seems like this is going to lead us too far off course from your presentation, then it's fine to put it to the side and maybe come back to it later. But I guess one thing that you might say, so you've said that Darwinian evolution helps us to distinguish, as you put it, local programming from human nature.
Yes.
Maybe it helps. I'm not really sure how far it helps, and even to the extent that it does, I think that, let's just say it's going to be a pretty unreliable guide. and not necessarily have normative force, even insofar as it does give us a guide. So maybe you're not claiming that it has normative force. You're just saying, well,
I think
it's sort
it
of
doesn't really
indicative.
have normative force,
Right.
per se.
Right.
So in the
Right.
in the example, I would say, now, if I were to act on my own evolutionary instincts, what I might want to do is kill and eat the men and then turn the women into a harem. But I know by ethics that that's wrong.
Right.
Ethics is a different source, and it tells me to override these instincts. I wouldn't even feel those instincts because I've had too many layers of ethical training
Okay, got it, right.
built on top of those. But so it's ethics that tells me I should practice hospitality and I should try to do something that the men and women in this group like. But evolutionary reasoning may give me some elucidate how to do it.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So we're already distinguishing between the normative conclusions and the Darwinian evolution.
Absolutely.
But it still seems like there might be a lot of complicated ways in which we're going to use this information, which are going to be difficult to elucidate based on Darwinian evolution alone, right? So among the things that a person might say, which again, if you want to set this example aside until later, that's fine with me. But suppose that a person were to say, all right, well, based on my observation of all of these wonderful charts that you've just presented about the good of heterosexual marriage, I have recognized that this is indeed a good sort of arrangement for people to enter into. It does all these positive things for us. And having seen that, I would like to enter into that kind of arrangement, but my experiences of attraction are almost exclusively to members of the same sex. So I'm going to freely agree that this is serving as a kind of a mimic or a copy of something that I've seen heterosexuals do. But if this is the best thing that's available to me, why is it not still good for me to sort of partially gratify those desires for permanence and fidelity and so on and so forth? And it seems to me like it's going to be really hard to come up with an argument from, for example, Darwinian evolution, why that's not a legitimate kind of reasoning. I mean, you can give lots of evidence that, well, this isn't the natural tendency of these relationships. Yeah, sure, fine. But that put it like this: if instincts are part of what's compelling us into these fulfilling heterosexual relationships, you might see the same-sex couple as lacking certain instincts that would help build and support that kind of relationship. But that wouldn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't still benefit in lots of wonderful and rich ways if they could sort of, you might say, overcome the challenge of those lack of supporting instincts and make it work. And you might say, well, those wonderful couples you see on the news, they're the people who have managed to appreciate how much this can do to enrich human life, and they manage to kind of, work without. Yeah, I mean, heterosexuals have it easier. They have all of these helpful, supportive instincts that make their relationships go. But you can still do it if you really try, and, that's something that people do want to try.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it would be just as plausible to say, yeah, even if you try really hard to make a same-sex marriage work, then it's not going to be particularly conducive to happiness because you don't have the same harmony of instincts, and that's where the happiness comes from. And what's more, you're much more likely to fail along the way. So we're sort of misdirecting people if we're telling same-sex attracted people, try to act like you're married, because it's not something that they're likely to achieve, and it's not something that's going to contribute to their flourishing in the same way, even if they do achieve it. And I think there are also other issues. For example, let's suppose that you know a middle-aged straight man who's married to a woman and who develops a crush on a 25-year-old secretary in his office who wants to have his kid. And he asks you, should I leave my middle-aged wife and take up with this young girl who wants to have my kids? So I think the answer is no, definitely not. You shouldn't do that. And then if you say why, say, well, just by the nature of women, your wife is going to be very much, I mean, there may be more arguments than this, but just one of them, then your wife is going to be very invested in the future of your relationship. She will be very attached to you. It will be very hard for her to recover from this blow, and in marrying her, she was really entitled to expect a permanent fidelity from you. There's kind of and whereas in the case of, now let's suppose you have a middle-aged man who's married to another man, suppose so-called married to another man, and he falls in love with a woman and wants to marry her to have kids. Now, I think the answer is different here. I think you'd say, well, there isn't a reason to think that he's going to be hurt in the same way that a woman would. And moreover, your goal for leaving the relationship, which is having children, is something that you couldn't do with the man that you were with. You sort of, if you had made that promise, you would have sacrificed that. But that's sort of something that's so essential to a human life. We really don't recognize people's right to sacrifice that forever. So I'm not doing full justice to it, but I think in lots of practical situations, then the answer to certain questions will hinge on.
Well, yeah, but I think you're giving answers that are already pretty obviously prejudiced by your pre-existing commitments, because I think that people who favor same-sex marriage would have no problem saying, of course it's wrong for you to leave your, committed same-sex partner if you agreed to have a faithful and committed relationship, and that's something that you've both been invested in for a huge length of time. No, you can't just look back to Darwinian evolution to explain why it's somehow less wrong than if you were to leave an opposite sex. I don't think they would find that persuasive
some of them might say that, and some of them might not. I think a lot of them would think that, well, if you feel that you're not attracted to that person anymore and you want a different life, then they would have a lot of respect for that. Should you sacrifice your whole life in a relationship that isn't what you want out of life, and your long-term happiness? But I think let's just say that it's two questions like this that I think some understanding of human nature as it's rooted, among other things, in biology, and values that inherently gives to human beings in life will shape the responses to lots of practical questions. Let me move forward. I think it might be clear sort of where the argument's going. So the emergence of the field of sociobiology goes back to kind of the 1970s, some major books in the 1970s. There's a phrase, the selfish genes, which was coined by sociobiologist Richard Dawkins. And the idea of this is that organisms can be altruistic. So it's not the grimmest version of a Darwinian world where organisms are engaged in relentless competition. Sometimes they're not engaged in competition. Sometimes they do cooperate. Sometimes they're altruistic towards each other. Because if you help your kin to survive, then you can help your genes to survive. And there's some other reasons too. For example, sometimes you may have an instinct for reciprocity because other organisms can perceive that instinct for reciprocity, and they'll treat you well in anticipation of that, in anticipation of getting reciprocity for you, and so you'll have an instinct to serve others. But what Dawkins would argue then is that the genes themselves are selfish. Sometimes they might make us altruistic. They're programming our instincts, but their goal is to facilitate their survival. Now, it will sound as if the selfish genes are conscious beings with intentions. That's not literally true, but one starts talking that way because the genes have been honed through a long evolutionary process to make us behave in certain ways. And so it's a useful metaphor, let's say. Now, this initially provoked outrage from the left because the left had traditions of believing in human autonomy and perfectibility, which sociobiology was really inconsistent with. It was sort of asserting an authoritative, a more fundamental human nature, and limiting our ability to define the good for ourselves. So that was a source of great provocation to many people on the cultural left. For Christians, that's not a surprise. We've always known that mankind is fallen, and so it's not surprising that the selfish genes give men a propensity for rape, for example. We can resist that propensity.
Not the usual Christian explanation of why men are fallen, but anyway,
right.
We don't have to get too hung up on that.
Well, wait, okay. Yeah, that's an interesting point. So the fall in the Bible initially is because of Adam and Eve's disobedience to God. And it's very interesting what follows then, which is that it seems that human nature becomes progressively corrupted, where people get worse and worse over time, and they also get shorter lifespans, and there's sort of mysterious things about how before Noah, for example, people weren't allowed to eat meat, but after Noah they could. Now, I'm certainly not going to propose a comprehensive theory for this, but that's much too difficult. But to me, the story seems consistent with evolution being part of what was driving the fall, where if there are potential bad traits in men, or traits that can be bad if exaggerated or somewhat distorted, those would tend to spread, because under conditions of alienation from God, then a gene for rape or a gene for murder may actually cause a person to flourish. So, I mean, as far as I'm not going to commit specifically to the Genesis account. I mean, these are very large questions, but I think, but the idea that mankind is fallen, and so that men may have a natural propensity for rape, I think that's very consistent with Christian tradition. And as far as whether the account of why that happens is consistent, that's a hard question. But I don't think this is part of the point of my describing Darwinian reasoning as reasoning from equilibrium, because you can be agnostic about origins. I think it's quite separable from any particular story of origins. We can say, given the way the world is now, or given the way the world was in prehistoric times that we know something about, then having a gene for rape could contribute to survival. And so it's not surprising that men have that propensity. And so then the moral law is given to us, conscience is given to us, and God gives commands to Moses, and then eventually the incarnation happens, all in God's effort to rescue us from the situation into which we'd fallen. Now, I'm not going to say that originated in a Darwinian fashion, but I think we can see that the prehistoric mankind would have had to have certain characteristics for human nature to be in equilibrium. Let me try to make this a little clearer. First of all, a little on why I'm an evolution skeptic. I just want to say this because I don't want people to mistake me for one of these surrender to Darwin, you flat earth Luddite ignoramuses type people. I think there are lots of things that introspection and experience reveal are real, but that evolution can't account for. So the existence of a universe with natural laws, ideas, beauty, the capacity of the human mind to understand nature, free will, moral right and wrong, humans' propensity to believe in God. Evolution can't really explain any of this. Of course, there are attempts, but they're very unconvincing. And moreover, some biologists in the intelligent design school argue that evolution is prohibitively improbable. So this is basically saying, okay, natural selection takes place, granted mutation takes place, yes, maybe it can give rise to some amount of order, but given the time spans that are available, can it give rise to anything like the amount of order that we observe? There's some probability there, high or low. It's very difficult to calculate, but efforts to calculate it have sometimes suggested it's extremely low. That life is just too complex, mutation and natural selection aren't powerful enough to explain it, and and possibly a high-profile convert to this cause is the secular philosopher Thomas Nagel, who recently wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos. The materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. So I'm very sympathetic to all this. I certainly don't want to insist that Christians bow down to the authoritative judgment of science on questions of evolution. I would want to make this argument in quite a different way. I'd say we know that living nature is in ecological equilibrium, however it got there. Organisms are constantly being born, growing, dying, and yet ecosystems remain kind of constant. They tend to look the same generation after generation, century after century, until mankind comes along and interferes. But in themselves, then they seem to be fairly consistent. And yet, we know from theory that the selfish genes are in perfect competition. I mean, we can see by reasoning from ordinary situations that occur in nature that organisms with certain types of traits would survive and reproduce more than others. Most of the gene pools that we can imagine would not be consistent with equilibrium. So you can imagine, suppose there were animals that couldn't eat. Well, God could create animals that couldn't eat, presumably, but they wouldn't last very long because they wouldn't be able to replenish the energy that they were burning off when they moved. So this wouldn't be in equilibrium, and pretty soon those animals would disappear. We could imagine animals that can produce only one offspring. Well, those would last a little longer, but sooner or later they'd die off because they wouldn't be able to replace themselves. So I'll give a couple examples of evolutionary reasoning applied to human nature. One is why battle courage is primarily a masculine trait. The other is the natural modesty of women. And I won't use any kind of meta-narrative about life emerging through evolution. We don't need that. That's actually superfluous, because the same reasoning would apply even if we assume God made the world 6,000 years ago. So first of all, battle courage. Let's suppose the contrary. Let's suppose that battle courage were a mainly female trait. So among women, you'd have some who would be braver, some less brave. Now, we can think of ourselves as being in sort of a Stone Age situation where you've got competing tribes who are often fighting with each other. The brave women would be more likely to die young. They'd be more likely to charge into battle and get themselves killed, but they would get a lot of prestige. This could lead to more mating opportunities. But for women, you can still have a kid only once a year, at most actually, and even less prestigious women could probably get pregnant that often. Well, it doesn't take that much mating to achieve that. So those who had less battle courage would tend to have more offspring. That means that in succeeding generations, women would have less and less battle courage, as the natural selection would select away from battle courage in women. Meanwhile, among men, you'd have some who were braver, some who were less brave. The brave men, again, would be more likely to die young. They might get more mating opportunities because of their prestige, so that's the trade-off. But with men, there's almost no biological limit on how much they can reproduce, other than how often they can mate. So if battle courage leads to mating opportunities, then the brave men would have more offspring, and so in the long run, then the genes that make men practice battle courage would gradually take over the gene pool. And so equilibrium requires that battle courage is a mainly male trait. And of course, that's what we observe, that throughout human history, that most of the fighting is done by men. Men like going to war much more than women do. So evolution shows us why that kind of has to be the case. And it doesn't matter how the world was created. If it were created differently than this, then it would converge back to this. So we can separate this reasoning from stories about origins. Similarly with, maybe I'll skip this because it's the same type of logic. I'm sort of short on time, but so for much of the 20th century, there was a strong movement to deny any kind of objective human nature. And Sartre talked about how human existence precedes ethics. Basically, we're condemned to be free. We fashion our own natures according to our own preferences, I guess, but sort of the begging the question of what our motives could be for fashioning ourselves in one way rather than another. Sociobiology comes in and provides overwhelming ammunition on the nature side of this debate. There is an objective human nature. Now, sociobiology has limits. I think I probably said something about those already, but it does explain some things well. I think it explains particularly well why men tend to be eager, women tend to be more coy in sexual matters. It explains why we observe polygamy and prostitution, always in the direction of men hiring prostitutes or men practicing polygamy rather than the other way around. And it sheds light on gender differences, on family relationships, why we love our children. And so what I advocate is for Christian apologists to do something that they've been doing for a long time, which in ancient times was called spoiling the Egyptians. So taking over thought originating in some non-Christian intellectual environment and then appropriating what's valid and making it part of the case for Christianity and Christian teachings while rejecting what's mistaken. So we did this with Plato and Aristotle. We did this in the Scientific Revolution, free market economics, Romanticism, and then Darwinism I see as being the latest chapter in this study.
So I have to go fairly soon, so I thought maybe it would be good to,
Yeah.
if it's okay with you, for me to just throw out a couple of questions here.
Yeah, let's do that.
Unfortunately, we won't be able to get into too much detail about the specifics of your marriage argument.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, but in a lot of ways, the disagreements that we have often do really come down to this more general question about the relationship of sociobiology to normative ethics and moral theory, right? That's an area where we haven't quite seen eye to eye. I think it's kind of interesting on this slide where you talk about the limitations of sociobiology, and you just kind of give a list, right? Sociobiology explains this well, it doesn't explain that well. Aspects of human life and society that you're satisfied with its explanation, ones where you're not. And of course, we don't have to get into specifics. Nathan and I, right, we've been arguing about the same subjects for years now, being, close age siblings. We've resurrected the same debates, over decades now. But a lot of our disagreements actually end up coming down to places where he's satisfied with a sociobiological explanation and I'm not. That is, sociobiology suggests X. He thinks X sounds kind of right. I don't, right? And so it's not even just about what the sociobiology says or, sort of whether we should trust it in general, but whether we trust it in this particular case. But it seems like what you're doing here, right, and this is what you're going to go on to do with marriage, is suggest that marriage is a case where sociobiology is helpful, right, and where we can draw on it to say certain positive things. But again, this seems to be an obvious case in which you're going to put it in category A, things sociobiology explains well. And people who are not committed to sociobiology are going to put it in category B, right? Something that it doesn't explain well. And why would anybody, unless you can explain some good reason to give it normative force, why would anybody be willing to defer just to sociobiology? Right? Unless you're already a committed materialist of some sort. But it doesn't seem like anybody ever has a compelling reason to draw on that if they're not persuaded by the conclusions that sociobiology presents.
A couple points here. One is that these are empirically testable claims. So particularly the ones where I say that sociobiology is explaining this well. Sociobiology will give us a theory. We can go out and test it in practice. So we can see, are males really sexually eager? Are females really sexually coy? Yes. We can confirm that with the data. Similarly, with something like with gender differences, we can confirm those. We can actually look at data to support that. And
right.
So,
sometimes we can.
Well, I think it ends up being quite powerful. To the point of overwhelming. But the second point is that if you think about what you would expect sociobiology to predict well, what's sociobiology all about? It's about how our instincts contribute to our survival and reproduction. So what would you expect it to explain? Well, stuff related to survival and reproduction. Things like sex, gender differences, family, nutrition, and so on that's directly related. Stuff like aesthetics, reasoning, religion, ethics, dress. These are not nearly as directly related to survival and reproduction. So that's exactly where we would expect sociobiology to not perform as well. And that's, I think, where we tend to find that it doesn't perform as well, both empirically and in terms of the strength of the logic of the explanations themselves.
Well, maybe. I mean, I don't really find that all that compelling, just because it seems to me like when you're talking about things as deep and sort of life-changing as intimate human relationships, absolutely, the body is relevant here, right? I mean, I certainly think it's relevant, but they involve far more than just the physical body, and that's one reason why I think from the very get-go, right? I mean, you laugh, and I'm not really trying to mock you, because we all do this, right? You know, we Catholic sort of natural law-oriented people do this too. We come up with these thorny phrases that sound totally unromantic for talking about marriage. But you still have to giggle a little bit when you go to the merger of genetic interests, right? You're like, well, don't say that when you're proposing, right? Let's merge our genetic interests, honey. And I understand, again, I'm mocking you, but gently, because we all do this, you know. Pope Francis joked at a recent conference, complementarity. Well, that's a lovely word, you know. So, I mean, we all do it, but nevertheless, it does kind of say something about a deeper problem, right? That everybody understands themselves to be doing far more than merging their genetic interests when they're talking about things like love and marriage. So just to say, well, we would expect sociobiology to give a good sort of prediction in this particular case. Well, maybe, but I think that's going to be pretty weak, right? If you're going to try to make that a major part of your argument.
Merger of genetic interests is kind of a translation into modern language of the one flesh principle in the Bible. That the man shall leave his mother and his
maybe you think so.
Wife, and they shall be one flesh. It's a very close conception to that. I think it's
well, maybe in your mind it is. I think I would attach quite a bit more to that passage than just merging of genetic interests. But anyway, that seems to me like this a fundamental problem. We may not have time to hash it out fully here, but unless you're a committed materialist, it doesn't seem like you have very strong reasons to defer to sociobiology on anything. You might use it as an interesting indicator of where there's certain kinds of interesting facts about human beings that you should at least kind of, take into account, consider when you're trying to figure out what kinds of relationships are going to be easier or more likely to work. But I think it's going to be really difficult for you ever to persuade anybody to pull something from category B, that is something that sociobiology fails to explain adequately, into category A, something where we should actually use sociobiology as some kind of serious guide to how we should be constructing, human lives and societies.
Well, I won't keep you longer. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, and on that note.
Now,
well, I have to say that I recommend a part 2 to this.
Yeah, well, that would be fun. Yeah, sorry that I can't stay longer today. But, yeah.
Yeah, we could set something up for a part 2, and then you could finish your presentation, and the sibling rivalry can continue.
Very good. Very good. That sounds great.
Sounds good.
So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for including me. Sorry that I couldn't stick around for the whole thing, but yeah, absolutely. I'll listen to the rest of the presentation, and maybe we can pick this up another time.
Okay.
Very good.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.